You know what's brutal about being an INFJ? People don't discover your strength when it's useful. They discover it after the mistake, after the betrayal, after the burnout, after the system breaks, when the consequences make the pattern undeniable. And here's the twist. Your strength isn't just empathy. It's the ability to detect weak signals early, mentally integrate them into a coherent story, and quietly forecast what other people can't see yet. Today, I'm going to explain why that's real, why it's ignored, and how to turn it into influence without turning into a bitter prophet no one wants to invite to the party. Quick note for the skeptical, INFJ is a typology label, not a diagnosis. Treat it as a shorthand narrative for a set of tendencies. The mechanisms we'll discuss, attention, stress physiology, rumination, emotional labor, apply broadly. Let's name the strength precisely. Early integration of social and ethical data into a forecast. In plain English, you don't just notice what someone said, you notice what they consistently avoid saying, what they reward, what they punish, what they rationalize, and what they quietly normalize. That's not mysticism, that's pattern recognition under uncertainty applied to humans. The tragedy is that early patterns rarely look dramatic. They look like a vibe, a tiny inconsistency, a tension no one wants to address. Your brain tries to compress dozens of micro-observations into one sentence, and the room hears that sentence as overthinking. Here's why the room misreads you. Confidence gets mistaken for accuracy. Loud gets mistaken for true. And early warning signals get mislabeled as negativity because people prefer emotional certainty. Because people prefer emotional certainty over probabilistic truth. Your gift is probabilistic truth. Low drama, high signal. So what people discover too late is not your kindness, it's your accuracy curve. You see the problem when it's still cheap to fix. They see it when it's expensive, public, and humiliating. Now let's talk about attention, because attention is the gatekeeper of reality. Most people believe they're noticing what's happening. They're actually noticing what their attention budget allows. When the task is narrow, counting passes, meeting a metric, maintaining an image, obvious things can walk through the scene and never enter awareness. In a classic study on inattentional blindness, 46% of observers failed to notice an unexpected event. Yes, the famous gorilla, even though it was clearly visible. That one statistic is a metaphor for your entire life. You keep pointing at the gorilla, and people keep insisting there is no gorilla. INFJs often function like an anomaly detector inside group dynamics. You're watching what no one assigned themselves to watch. The tone shifts, the power moves, the quiet exclusions, the compliance rituals, the little ethical cuts that later become a hemorrhage. The group is counting passes, performance, optics, harmony, so your warning feels irrelevant until the collapse. And here's the part people don't say out loud. Early pattern detection threatens identity. Because if you're right, if the relationship is sliding, if the workplace is toxic, if the leader is unstable, then everyone else has to admit they were participating. Denial is not a lack of intelligence, it's a defense against shame. So when you say something feels off, the room often hears, I'm accusing you. That's why your gift is discovered too late. It forces accountability before the evidence is socially acceptable. If you've been dismissed your whole life, don't click off yet. Because next, I'll explain the brain network that makes your intuition feel certain and how to use it without spiraling. Let's translate intuition into neuroscience. One reason INFJ insight feels like it arrives fully formed is because the brain is constantly building a narrative model, an internal story that stitches memory, meaning, and prediction into a coherent self and world simulation. The default mode network, or DMN, is strongly associated with internally focused thought, self-reflection, mind-wandering, personal memory, and envisioning the future. In other words, the DMN is the brain's meaning-making studio. It doesn't just store experiences, it organizes them into a storyline. Now here's the danger. The same network that integrates meaning can also trap you in loops, especially when the social world is uncertain. In depression research, meta-analytic findings highlight reliably increased functional connectivity between the DMN and the subgenual prefrontal cortex. Connectivity that often predicts levels of depressive rumination. That's a clinical extreme, but the mechanism matters for high-conscience people. Your narrative engine can become a courtroom. If you're an INFJ, you don't just ask, what happened? You ask, what does this mean about who I am, who they are, and what happens next? That's DMN forecasting. It is your narrative engine in action. And it's why you often detect patterns early. You are constantly connecting dots across time. But it's also why you can feel burdened by foresight, because you experience tomorrow's consequences today. There's also evidence that context can reduce rumination and shift neural activity. In a study on nature exposure, a 90-minute walk in a natural setting decreased self-reported rumination and neural activity in the subgenual prefrontal cortex, while an urban walk did not. That matters because it shows your inner narrator is not fate, it's state-dependent. Now we layer attachment because this is where pattern detection becomes either a superpower or a survival strategy. If you learned early that emotional safety depended on reading caregivers, predicting moods, and preventing explosions, your nervous system didn't develop intuition. It developed hypervigilance with a moral compass. Attachment theory describes different regulation strategies. In the attachment literature, hyperactivating strategies keep a person on the alert for threats, separations, and betrayals, while deactivating strategies keep the attachment system in check with costs to cognitive and emotional openness. That line, alert for threats, is the origin story of many INFJs who feel older than their age and wiser than they wanted to be. Empirically, anxious attachment is explicitly linked to rejection sensitivity, constant vigilance, and physiological stress pathways. In one study of married couples, higher attachment anxiety was associated with higher cortisol and fewer T-cell counts. Your body doesn't treat relational uncertainty as a thought, it treats it as a threat. Now add the stress response. Polyvagal theory describes a hierarchy of autonomic states: ventral vagal, sympathetic, and dorsal vagal. And importantly, the dorsal vagal complex is associated with metabolically conservative defensive reactions like death feigning. A separate threat response tradition, the defense cascade, also describes staged responses: freeze, flight, fight, tonic immobility, shutdown, and faint. Here's the INFJ specific consequence. You often sense the threat early, but your body chooses the safest social strategy: silence, observation, restraint. So your accuracy arrives inside you, but doesn't land in the room until the room is already bleeding. Your nervous system optimized for survival, not persuasion. Section 5, now we have to talk about emotional labor because it's the invisible tax INFJs pay for being socially fluent. Emotional labor is the job or role-based requirement to manage emotions and displays to meet socio-emotional demands. Hochschild is credited with observing surface acting, putting on the expected emotional mask, versus deep acting, trying to generate the required feelings. INFJs are often unpaid emotional laborers. You don't just manage your emotions, you manage the room's emotions. In a study of hotel managers, surface acting correlated with job-related exhaustion at R-41. That's not a quirk, it's a measurable resource drain. Here's where neuroscience hits. Suppression looks like control, but it's often a physiological tug-of-war. Brain imaging shows why suppression feels exhausting. It can keep the threat system lit while you look calm. In one fMRI study, suppression produced increased amygdala responses. Meanwhile, reappraisal showed earlier prefrontal responses with decreased amygdala responding. That is the biology of "I'm fine," said through clenched teeth. Now, the moral layer. When you repeatedly silence your clarity to keep peace, you can accumulate something adjacent to moral injury. In one sample, those screening positive for moral injury had 3.38x higher odds of current suicidal ideation. This validates what your body already knows. Chronic self-betrayal is not sustainable. You're not watching for entertainment. You're watching for language that finally fits your experience. Join my free email list to get these frameworks without fighting the feed. And my ebook, Inside the Mind of INFJ, is on Amazon. I'll show you how to turn detection into influence. Let's convert insight into leverage. The mistake INFJs make is assuming that being right is persuasive. It's not. Persuasion is state management plus structure. If the room is threatened, your truth becomes a threat. So the move is not say less or say more. The move is sequence your signal. Here's what neuroscience supports. Reappraisal is different from suppression. It reliably activates cognitive control regions and modulates amygdala responses. Translation: when you change meaning early, you can change downstream threat activation. If your strength is early detection, your skill must be early framing. It sounds like I might be wrong. Tell me if I am, but I'm seeing 3 signals that usually predict X. This protects the listener's status. It moves you from prophet to analyst. You need a private outlet for the intensity so you don't leak it sideways. Expressive writing is one evidence-backed option. What this does is convert vibe into hypothesis and hypothesis into action. Convert your vibe into hypothesis so your gift becomes useful on time.